So, this week's question: how to reconcile what's going on with the world today with what God wants from me? Right? This is a good question because it's a dialogue that happens all the time in Christianity. Right? People are always this is a very common thing that you hear in the churches, the way our country is going, with the way the world is, etc., implying that it's very bad and there's a lot of turmoil and a lot of sin, and what are we supposed to do about it as Christians? So that's what I'm going to answer today. And it's a good question because a lot of people want to know, what are we supposed to do in the political realm? What are we supposed to, which anytime that's said from a church, everyone goes, I got to get out of here. Look at the time, right? But it'll be user-friendly today. So, how to reconcile what's going on with the world today and with what God wants from me. How are we supposed to deal with how the world is as a Christian? First slide, please. I've got 3 forewords. I've got 3 things to preface this message with today, right, that I want to clarify before we get started. Number 1 is the topic of spiritual gifts. The answer that I'm going to give today does not apply to everyone, right? Everybody has different callings. Everybody has different gifts, right? I'm speaking to what I think is the vast majority of Christians, but again, that's not everybody. Most people aren't called to be in the public eye, but some are, right? Some of us are called to be politicians. Some of us are called to be public figures or, local celebrities or work on the national level or whatever. Just like some of us are called to be missionaries. That's going to be a topic of today too, because we're talking about problems on a global scale. But a lot of us aren't, right? We're supposed to be missionaries here, and we'll talk about that biblically. But some of us are, right? And to those people that are called to be that, you can clock out right now. It's going to be boring. Okay. No. It's going to be great. Number 2 forward. Christians should combat evil. And that seems like an obvious one, right? But it'll make sense why I'm saying it now later in the message. Christians are called to combat evil, to deal with the bad things in our world, not just religiously, but secularly, right? We should be trying to diminish bad stuff in the world, evil. It's a definite principle of the Bible that we should be fighting to diminish evil in the world, but we're often called to do this just by promoting Jesus. Here is the clock-out point, if you don't want to listen to the rest of the message. This is essentially what I'm going to say, is combating evil in the world is often overcomplicated, right? As Christians, it's simple to do our part to combat evil, right? Take a serious investment in your relationship with God and live out your commitment to live for Him the best way that you can, right? That is our calling to combat evil, because that does things like promote justice, promote honesty, promote morality, promote love. That's the essential principle of our religion, right? Is loving others. So if we're following Jesus and promoting Him and having God be our number 1 thing in our life, we're going to be combating evil. But we'll come back to that. But we should be combating evil. That's a definite thing. Number 3, if you go to a different church, you'll hear a different answer, but I'm right. What I'm going to say is not what everybody is going to say. And that's okay, right? This is... I've got, I think, a reasonable argument from the Bible. I've got good biblical evidence and historical evidence, but that doesn't mean that I'm absolutely correct. And if you go to another church, you'll hear a different Christian perspective. Of course, again, I'm right, but not everyone would say so. If you turn on John Hagee today, he's going to be saying the exact opposite thing that I'm saying right now. So just have that in mind. And I say that because I think it encourages a Christian principle that is often overlooked. We should be thinking critically about God all the time for ourselves, right? Don't ever go to a church and just take what someone says absolutely and without question. Here, anywhere else. Don't ever say, well, Josh said, so it must be good. I don't know. I do know what I'm talking about, but I'm definitely wrong about some stuff. Also, don't go to a church if the person isn't willing to admit that. Because they'd be Jesus, right? It's a fallacy. But look at this topic and all hard topics with caution, because the person that you're learning from might not be correct. So just have that in the back of your mind and go home and think about, what do I think about this? Is Josh right? I don't know. I always like doggy bag sermons because you have to take it home, right? Okay, next slide. That's my 3 forwards. Go back to that slide. I want to go over one more time. Spiritual gifts. Everyone's called to do different things. All Christians should combat evil. and Josh might not be right. Next slide. A reoccurring misconception. Something that people have been saying forever, and this is a big premise of my argument. Our generation is worse than any other generation before us. You know who said that? Literally everyone. Every generation that has been alive has said that our generation is worse than any generation before us. It's found in the Bible multiple times, right? Generations are all bad. That's just a part of it. So this is not, if you think that you're special in saying our country is worse than it's ever been, or this generation is getting so bad, a lot of people have said that over time. All of them, right? Think back to the generation before you. Did they say that about you? I would assume so, right? Because there's always change. And anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. Here's 2 biblical principles to back up that this is a misconception that our generation is worse than any other generation. Here's a hint of what is going on with this slide, and what I'm going to say by the end of it. It's not. Our generation isn't any worse than any other generation that's ever existed. Here's some biblical proof of that. There's nothing new under the sun. That's what Ecclesiastes is all about, is that the world doesn't really change. Right? The basic human principles are always going to be... Hey guys. Basic human principles are always going to be the same thing. Right? People want respect and love, and people are going to misuse information to try and acquire that. Right? Nobody really changes. It's all the same thing. And one proof of that is that every generation has said that above statement about our generation is worse than the generation before us. But there's nothing new. And here's what's not new. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There's sin and corruption in the world, and there's always been sin and corruption in the world, and there's always going to be sin and corruption in the world. Right? Until Christ comes back, that's just going to be a part of our existence. It's bad stuff. Right? So, what's going on in the world today? Nothing new. Right? Nothing new. There's nothing new. There's not. America is not some wasteland of debauchery that hasn't existed in the past. There's always been some cultural phenomenon of bad stuff that's going on. Take any Christian hot topic right now. That's happened in the past and in greater quantities. Right? There's always been nothing new. Next slide, please. There are people that are sinful, perverse, and corrupt in every part of history, and the way and amount in which the sin manifests itself changes only slightly. Right? There's been, if you went back to the Renaissance right before the Reformation, the big sin would be church corruption. Right? I think that we have less church corruption now, but we've got more of something else. Right? The way that the world has been bad has just changed. So we can say, oh, look at this thing that's happening. You know, that this is worse than it was before. Yeah, but something else is better. You know, there's more goodwill, or the church is more unified, or something like that. We've got to not just look at the bad things that are going right now. We've got to examine it through the history of the world. We've got to recognize that it's been worse than this before. Our world isn't any worse than it's ever been. Asterisk, because I want to remind everybody again, John Hagee literally bases his entire ministry off of the world is the worse now than ever. Right? I do not agree with that. And people have been saying that every generation. But just a forewarning, that's what he says. Look at things like, we could look at things through history too. Like look at killing Christians. That's a big, you might be saying, Josh, people are killing Christians right now. That's so bad. People have always been killing Christians. Right? If you go back to ancient Rome, they did it for fun. Right? And the most complex, advanced society of the time was the one that was perpetuating that. That would be like if America and Great Britain right now, or whoever, right? If the top dogs of the world were killing Christians for entertainment. That's what Rome was doing. Right? And any hot button topic since then has always been happening. Political turmoil, an acceptance of homosexuality or abortion, right? Large amounts of Christians leaving the faith. Whatever Christians are complaining about right now has always been happening, right? There's always been instances where it's been worse. There's not anything new under the sun. And every generation has said this is the worst generation. Okay, now you might be thinking, that's kind of morbid, and I don't like where you're going, Josh, but it'll get better. Whether I'm right or not, and whether the world isn't any worse than it's ever been or not. Lingering on how bad the world is a problematic way of thinking. And this is my main point. I might be wrong in saying that the world isn't any worse than it's ever been, right? I might be right. But either way, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. If we keep talking about, if there's a dialogue in church or in our life of the country's so bad right now, that's not how we should be thinking as Christians, right? It's problematic. Here's why. Problematic thinking. This is the series that we just had about let the meditation of my heart be acceptable in the sight of the Lord. Don't meditate on the negative. Meditate on God. Keep your eyes focused on Jesus. Right? We're not going to go to all these verses, but I'm just going to read them, talk about them right now. I'm citing them for the argument. Right? Colossians 3:1 says, keep your eyes focused on the things above, not on the things of this earth. Right? Philippians 4:8. I've got to look at that one now that I've forgotten about it. Who's got it? Bible thumpers. Anybody know? I think that's whatever is true, whatever is right, and whatever is worthy of praise. Think on these things. But I thought that was in Romans now. Anyway, it's a verse up there that's for that. Psalms 19 is about self-reflection and not having negative thinking about the way the world is going around, or is going on around us. Right? These are all verses of things of the biblical principle. Keep your eyes on Christ. Right? Don't focus on what's bad in the world. Focus on God's glory. Right? Focus on what you should be doing in your own life to promote God's glory. Right? And I want to highlight Peter's example. Peter, right, when he saw Jesus walking on the water, Jesus was out there doing this miraculous thing, and it was full of glory because it was Jesus on the water. Peter wants to take that leap of faith and go out to it. So he goes out, and, it's the age-old analogy. As long as Peter's eyes are on Christ, he's doing a miraculous work. And he's working as a Christian the way that he should. Doing miraculous things by the power of God. Right? And when his eyes are focused on Christ, he's able to do that. But when he starts to look at the waves, he sinks. Right? Keep your eyes on Christ so that you can do miraculous things. If we keep saying, oh, look how bad the country is, and look how bad the state of the world is in, that's looking at the waves. Christians love to say, look at the waves. Right? The waves are way worse than they've ever been. Right? We've got to stop focusing on those things. We've got to focus on Christ. Only then can we walk on water, figuratively speaking. And, in Peter's case, legitimately, right? Truly. So that's the first thing. We've got to keep our eyes focused on Christ. Stop focusing on the negative in the world. Number two, this highlights the problem of overindulging in judgment. Right? Why do we think this about the world is worse than it's ever been? One reason is that it could be just genuine concern. Right? We might be looking at the world around us and say, it's worse than it's ever been. I've got to do something. And I think that that's a good portion of Christians. And that's a good way to think, or it's a good reason to think that way, but it's not a good way to think. Right? We should be taking those good intentions and focusing them on the Lord. But another problem that this has with judgment, and what I've seen a lot in the church problem in thinking is judgment, right? It's this Christian finger wagging, loving to say, well, the world is so bad right now. God's just got to do his smiting stuff. It's an overindulgence in judgment. Part of that train of thought comes from, again, the series on meditation. That's a good, easy, tasty thought to have. If we poo-poo the world and talk about how bad it is, that tastes good, it makes us feel better about ourselves. Right? The worse that the world is, and the more that we're a good, normal person, and the more we highlight that contrast, the better it makes us feel. Right? If we say, oh, the world is so bad and I'm doing fine, it makes us look better. That's what a lot of judgment is putting other people down to make ourselves feel better, I think. But Christians shouldn't do that. Right? We should live in humility, and we should live in judgment-free. How to combat evil? Here's the original question again. Trade judgment for self-reflection and improvement. This is all over the Bible, and this is a big problem, I think, in the church. People are always wondering, why are Christians, or why are millennials leaving the church? I think that this is part of the reason right now. Right? We're not trading judgment for self-reflection and improvement. The citations here are Jesus' teaching and his condemnation of the Pharisees. Right? The whole log in the eye sermon. Jesus says, stop trying to take the speck out of your other brother's eye when you've got a log in your own. That's right to the Christians, right? So the Pharisees at the time, but that's us, modern day equivalent, right? Stop claiming to be religious and blaming others and condemning others. The condemnation of the Pharisees, Jesus is always criticizing and trying to make light of the problems in his own institution. Christians, if we're going to criticize anyone, we should be having constructive criticism of ourselves and of our church. Stop trying to say, oh, the country's bad. Well, we're not involved in the secular country, right? We're involved here at the church, and we should be making changes with who we are, right? Jesus never talks about how bad the Romans are. Jesus never, constantly complains about the culture in which he's in at the time, right? But what does he criticize? The way the Pharisees are claiming to be godly but aren't, right? His own religious institution got far more criticism than the culture. That does not happen in church. Today, we say stuff like, oh, the church is doing great, but man, we got to get the church out there more and change America because it's so bad. Which, that's a nice attitude to have. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be encouraging of churches and supporting churches. We definitely should be. We should be involved in Christian culture and be promoting the church's mission. But it should be swamped. We should be saying, here's how we can change the church more to do more good, right? And stop blaming others. So trade your judgment for self-reflection and improvement, both individually and in our institution, right? And keep your eyes on Christ so that you don't sin. Next slide. So here's a recap of what we talked about so far, and then I've got 2 more points before we end. The world's not any worse off than it's ever been, right? According to Josh. And other things. Keep your eyes focused on Jesus so that you can walk on water. That's the church and individuals, right? And then trade judgment for introspection and progression, right? We should be trying to improve ourselves, right? Have you ever played on a sports team or been a part of like a workplace, and there's some kind of problem going on in that sports team or that workplace? The most productive workplace or sports team are when all of the players or workers or whatever highlight the things that they do wrong and say, I've got to improve, right? If you go to, when I worked at Five Guys, if I went to a work meeting and everyone blamed everyone else, that restaurant did not progress. And that meeting did not go well, right? It's when people look at themselves with humility and sober judgment and have self-reflection, admit their faults, that's when things got better. That's when things became more efficient. And it works the same way in our church, right? If we're, as Christians, out there blaming others, there's not going to be any progression. We're not going to get better individually in our own faith, and the church isn't going to progress in the world, right? So we've got to trade judgment for introspection and progression. How should we live? And this is my last little section. Again, this is going back to the forward. Christians should be combating evil. I said that thing about world's not any worse than it's ever been, and I've made this whole stick about how we should be looking at ourselves. That's all true, I think, but Christians should be combating evil. That's still a definite principle of the Bible, right? We should be trying to make the world a better place and decrease sin and increase Jesus. How? Here's a side note. Let's pause. We should vote. I'm not going to talk about this very long, but the Bible does tell us to be involved in our communities and take part in the social structures that we are placed in, right? So be informed, vote. If we swing this pendulum too far to the left, right, there are some Christians that say, oh man, don't be involved in politics at all. Don't be informed, don't vote. We serve the kingdom of the Lord. We do serve the kingdom of the Lord, but God also provides room for us to have interests and passions. God also provides room for us to be involved in our community, right? That's part of how we advance the kingdom of the Lord. So have godly principles, get out there and vote, be informed. It's important. That's a part of the way that we combat evil. You should be interested in politics and interested in society and be informed. But it's to take a back seat to Christ, right? The Bible tells us to have our number one priority be God, right? And we should be using God or using our interests and our passions in our society to facilitate our service to God, right? So it's still good to be informed and vote. We should do that as Christians. But that, I don't think, is how we combat evil on the global scale. Here's how I think in a nutshell. In your immediate social circle, Focus on your relationship with God and make good on your commitment to live for Him. Right? And these verses are what the Bible talks about all the time. Using what we have and where we are to serve the Lord. Right? Each of these 3 verses that I have cited here, they talk about not just like some specific action to take, but what our philosophy as Christians should be as a whole. Micah 6:8 says to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with the Lord. Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, and I'm going to actually read these so I don't butcher them. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of all mankind. Right? And finally, James 1:27 says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Right? It's not, again, people are called to different things, but being a Christian isn't being an activist, right? That's not a necessity. It's not about being some kind of social reformer on a large scale, right? It's about serving God where we are with what we have, right? Take part, and God has placed you where you are, right? Probably. And if you keep following the Lord, you'll do your part in combating evil. God always says that what we have to serve Him is enough, right? But we just have to give it all. But wherever we are, doing our part is being fully invested in our faith. And if we all did that, right, then God's kingdom would come to fruition, right? 1 Timothy says that the believer that doesn't take care of his family and his household is worse than the person that scoffs at God, right? Our local community is very important to God. And wherever you are, God has called you to work for Him there. McDonald's needs Christians just as much as, a poor country does. Those poor countries need Christians, right? Some people are called to be missionaries. But the factories need Christians, right? The gas station needs Christians. You all know I do a lot of stuff. I do a lot of stuff in theater. We need Christians there, right? God has given us these interests and passions so that we can facilitate serving Him. Every part of the world needs Christians. So wherever you are, with whatever you have, just serve the Lord. Be a Christian and take full stock in it, and you'll do your part in combating evil. First example I have cited is 2 pennies, where the widow gives 2 pennies. It's not much, but she gives more than the Pharisees, who give great amounts out of their surplus. But she gives all that she has. It doesn't matter what the amount is. As long as we're fully invested in the Lord, that's enough for God. We don't have to be rich. We don't have to be super influential. We just have to be all in. Right? That's all God wants us to do. Let's go to John 6, which is the only place that we're actually going to turn to today. And this is a kind of a classic example, I think, for what we're talking about here today. We've actually talked about this passage quite a few times this year, but we're going to do it again. And let's start on verse 2. So that's page 75 in the New Testament, and if you're using the green Bibles in the pews. Okay, if you got it, say, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Say, woo. That's fun. Okay, here we go. Chapter 6, verse 2. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. Boom, right there is a great testimony for Christ, right? People mobilize and follow Christ when they see Him work. When Jesus does Jesus stuff, people flock to it, right? And if we're really reflecting Christ, if we're really doing what Jesus is doing and doing the works of God, right? It's easy to have people come to your church. It's easy to have people follow God because when they see the works of God, they flock to Him. A large crowd, right? Okay, verse 3. Then Jesus went up the mountainside, and there He sat down with His disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews was near. Therefore Jesus, lifting up His eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to Him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?" This He was saying to test Him, for He Himself knew what He was intending to do. Verse 7, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive even a little. This reflects the problem of Christianity right now, right? We see this magnitude of evil in the world, and we say, there's nothing I can do, and it's way too overwhelming. We can't facilitate the problem, right? We can't do what we're supposed to do to fix what's going on, right? There's too much, there's too many. Let's read verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people? Another question that Christians ask. This is the whole message that we've been talking about. I've got this. I'm here in my situation. You know, we're speaking, me, Josh, is speaking at this church right now, but how can that affect the world, right? How can my small gift provide for so many? But with Christ it can, right? With whatever we're doing, Christ can take our small resources and impact the world globally, right? Let's keep reading. Let's do verse 9 again. There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people? Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, in a number about 5,000. Jesus then took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated. Likewise also of the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were filled, he said to the disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost. Hey guys. Verse 13, so they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which they had left over by those who had eaten. When we give our small resources, we can affect change globally, right? With Jesus, he transforms our stuff, where we are, with what we have, to affect the masses, right? Some people are called to be missionaries, yeah, right? Some people are called to be in the public eye. But if you think that you are doing something that isn't substantial where you are, that's a fallacy. Right? If you think that God can't work through you in your life, that's wrong. Right? With Christ, all things are possible. Right? So if we take stock in our faith with wherever we are, and we're all in for God, we not only change the lives of the people around us, right, but we affect the global scale. Right? So how do we combat evil? Fear God, keep his commandments. That's the whole duty of mankind. Right? Look after the orphans and widows in their distress. Right? Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with the Lord. It's easy. I don't know if it's easy, but it's simple. Right? Just live for the Lord. And with what you have, it'll make stuff happen. Right? Next slide. Oh, I got one more thing. Good. Last thing, really quick. And I'm just going to tell this story because, A, we're running out of time, and it's a long story anyway. Right? First chapter of 1 Samuel. There's Hannah, who can't have children. Right? She's barren, and she's in a horrible situation with where she is, and she's very distressed. Right? There's Eli, the high priest. Hannah goes to the temple to pray. Right, and she's so distressed that she's weeping and horribly sad and distraught, and it's kind of making a ruckus. And Eli goes to see what's up. Eli just invests himself in this woman who is sad. He says what's wrong, she tells him, and then Eli blesses her as the high priest and says, may God bless you and this thing work. Right? Because he took an investment in Hannah when she was sad. He went to comfort one person, right? Then Samuel was born. And because this happened and God provided for Hannah through Eli, right? Samuel was born. He was the high priest of the temple. He crowned David king. And because David was king and sought after God's own heart, that paved the way for Christ to affect all of us, right? Because of one thing. Because Eli took an investment in someone's life that changed history forever, right? That was the beginning of the end game in the Bible, because one person went to a crying woman and said, "What's wrong?" Right? So if we think that our small gift for God is not enough, that's wrong. God can take our resources and do great things with it. Change all of history. Show His love to millions of people, as long as we're doing what's right, as long as we're following Him. When we give what we have, it's enough. Do I have one more slide? I don't. Okay. Keep your eyes on Christ, right? When you focus on Him, you don't sink, and give what you have, it's enough. That's the point of today. That's how we combat evil. Okay, we're going to have another word of prayer and take an offering, and then we're going to sing a couple more songs, and we'll be dismissed. So I hope everyone got something from today, and again, try and say hello to someone before you go. I hope you felt welcome and good. Okay, let's pray.